and just got that thumbs up and we're good to go. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation as a part of the North Carolina Black Summit virtual experience. My name is Marcus Bass. I have the pleasure of serving as Deputy Director for the North Carolina Black Alliance, and I am joined today by an amazing group of individuals that have held a historical, a contextual, a strategic framework for North Carolina. And as a part of this virtual experience, I think it is a very good moment in this midterm election season on the second day of early voting to really set the ground for what we are going through. The conversation based around our theme, building Black power in uncertain times, is very fitting when we talk about the state of democracy right now and the uncertainty that lies in our governmental systems. But the individuals that you are going to hear from today are going to help us lay out a framework for some of the context behind some things that may seem unusual, but are historical in nature. This conversation is also going to be broadcasted, not just in this live format, but later on for discussion. So for those of you that are joining us live, welcome. And for those of you that are joining us post-conversation, there is a lot of information to share, and this information does not get outdated. My name is Marcus Bass, again, Service Deputy Director, and I'm going to run through our biography of panelists. The first introduction is going to be of Dr. Jarvis Hall. Dr. Jarvis A. Hall is an Associate Professor of Political Science at North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina. From 2006 to 2015, Dr. Hall was Director of the Institute for Civic Engagement and Social Change at North Carolina Central. Prior to becoming director of the Institute, Dr. Hall chaired the Department of Political Science from 1998 to 2005. In addition, he served as director of the Academic Community Service Learning Program from 2006 to 2008 at North Carolina Central University. Dr. Hall attended North Carolina A&T State University, and as an undergraduate, received his Master's of Public Policy degree from the University of Michigan as a graduate student. Later, Dr. Hall earned his doctorate in political science from Duke University, and he works with several political and policy organizations on progressive policy issues. He has served as the chair of the Political Action Committee of the North Carolina NAACP for 2 years, and has served on the boards of the National Civic League, the North Carolina Center for Voter Education, the North Carolina American Civil Liberties Union, and the Carolina Justice Policy Center. Dr. Hall has taught at North Carolina A&T, St. Lawrence University, and Washington and Lee University. He has been at North Carolina Central since 1995. His teaching and research interests include African American politics, social movements, grassroots politics, civil rights, public policy, and electoral behavior. He is married to Rosalind Fuse Hall, and they have a daughter named Toya, which means love brings happiness. Our second panelist for today is Professor Erv Joyner. Professor and attorney Erv Joyner has worked as professor at North Carolina Central University School of Law since 1982. From 84 to 92, attorney Joyner served as the associate dean of the North Carolina School of Law. He regularly teaches courses in criminal law, criminal procedure, civil rights, race, and the law. As a member of the faculty, Professor Joyner serves on a number of law school and university committees. Professor Erving Joyner has written 3 editions of his book, Criminal Procedure in North Carolina, which is published by LexisNexis Publishing Company. He regularly prepares annual supplements to that publication. The first edition was published in 1989, the second in 1999, and the third was published in 2006. Additionally, Professor Joyner has written a number of articles and manuscripts for continuing legal education programs. He speaks and lectures regularly at legal education, civil rights, political empowerment, and educational advancement programs. Professor Joyner provides legal counsel to several political, religious, and community organizations and to needy individuals in civil rights and criminal appeals cases. He has served on several state study commissions and agencies in leadership roles with a variety of community groups and organizations. This service includes a 5-year term as the vice chairperson of the 1898 Wilmington Riot Commission. He is also a regular legal commentator for local, state, and national media, primarily in the areas of law, politics, civil rights, and racial justice. Along with Professor April Dawson, he co-hosts the highly acclaimed Legal Eagle Review, which is dedicated to a discussion of current local and national legal issues and is heard each Sunday evening on WNCU 90.7 FM. In 2004, Professor Joyner was honored as the Lawyer of the Year by the George H. White Bar Association, an organization of African-American lawyers in Durham County, and is a past recipient of the Lawyer of the Year Award by the North Carolina Association of Black Lawyers. In 2006, he was honored by NCCU Law residents and school students as Professor of the Year. Over the years, he has received a number of honors and awards for his work as professor. A civil rights and criminal law litigator and community and political activist, Professor Attorney Joyner and his family are members of the Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church in LaGrange, North Carolina, the church in which he was raised and now serves as a legal counsel and advisor. Our third panelist is Dr. Robert Corstan, Emeritus Professor of Public Policy and History at Duke University. He received his BA and PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research includes interests in the 20th century US history, the labor history, African-American history, and contemporary social policy. His publications include Fragile Democracy, which we'll learn a little bit more about in a few minutes, The Struggle Over Race and Voting Rights in North Carolina, co-authored by the University of North Carolina Press and James Laludis, who you'll hear of later on in the conversation. He's also authored To Right These Wrongs, the North Carolina Fund and the Battle to End Poverty and Equity in 1960s. He co-authored that as well with the University Press. Civil Rights, Unionism, Tobacco Workers, and the Struggle for Democracy in the Mid-20th Century South. Remembering Jim Crow, African-American Talks About Life in the Segregated South. Like a Family, The Making of a Southern Cotton Mill, and several other publications. Conan Morgan, our final panelist, is a whirlwind of movement, activity, and energy. He is the founder and CEO of Longleaf Agency, working alongside political organizations addressing technological needs, including web design, data mining, and database management. Conan has experience leading political candidates to victory at every level of the ballot. Beyond all of his commitments, Conan is very involved with community, political, and educational activities. He is the former president of the Young Democrats of North Carolina. He has served as a part of the state executive committee of the North Carolina Democratic Party and volunteers as a part of the North Carolina Science Olympiad, among other activities. Conan has been able to combine his education in computer science with his passion for politics and discovered a career that engages all of his personality and drive and interest into a calling that shapes the world all around us. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very exciting conversation breaking down this uncertainty, and I present to you now Dr. Corstan, who is going to give us an introduction into the work of Fragile Democracy.
Thank you, Marcus, for that introduction. It's really a great honor to participate in this year's North Carolina Black Summit and share some insights from Fragile Democracy. Fragile Democracy is a book about the past that has its origin in contemporary concerns. It's based on work that Jim Laludis and I have done as expert witnesses in court cases involving the right to vote in North Carolina. The first was centered on House Bill 589, the sweeping revision of election law undertaken by the Republican majority in the state legislature in 2013. And that law, you'll recall, was ultimately thrown out by the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which ruled that it targeted minority voters, in the words of the court, with near surgical precision. Now, as historians and participants in these contests over voting rights, we share another observer's sense that, quote, the politics of today is continuous with the past, that the struggle over the right to vote in our time is not unique, but is instead the latest episode in a contest that stretches back as far as the end of the Civil War and the death of slavery. That's why we've looked to history to explain today's struggle over race and voting rights, and it's why we wrote Fragile Democracy, to share what we've discovered. Now, one of the book's central arguments is that North Carolina and the United States more generally, the battle over voting rights is played out in emancipatory politics, retrenchment. The pattern repeated multiple times since emancipation. Blacks and progressive white allies have formed political movements to end racial injustice and lay claim to the rights of equal citizenship. They've done so not only to advance their own interests, but also to promote participatory democracy more generally. and to make government responsive to the needs of all its people. The first of these episodes occurred during what we call the long era of Reconstruction, which ran from emancipation in 1865 to the white supremacy campaigns of 1898 and 1900, which established at the beginning of the 20th century what we know as the Jim Crow era of racial segregation. This long era of Reconstruction is marked on one end by North Carolina's Constitution of 1868, which I hope if you haven't looked at, you will. It was written by representatives of a progressive biracial alliance organized within the state's newly formed Republican Party. That document guaranteed universal male suffrage. It removed property restrictions for election to high office. It established North Carolina's first statewide system of public schools and created a state board of public charities to make, in the words of the Constitution, beneficent provision for the poor, the unfortunate, and the orphan. What's at play here is a radically inclusive vision of American democracy and of government's role in advancing human flourishing. White elites who called themselves conservatives opposed that vision and sought to destroy it. They did so through violence and erecting barriers around the ballot box. Think of the Klan of the late 1860s, early 1870s, and the ways it used intimidation and political assassination to suppress the votes of Blacks and their white political allies. Or jump forward to the virulent white supremacy campaign carried out by the North Carolina Democratic Party between 1898 and 1900. In that campaign, white supremacists stoked fears of what they called Negro domination. They organized squads of vigilantes known as red shirts to harass voters at the polls. In Wilmington, they staged a murderous coup that drove the city's biracial government from office. All of this set the stage for an amendment to the state's constitution in 1900 that aimed to end biracial politics once and for all by taking away the vote from Black men in large numbers of poor whites as well, and doing so in part by making the right to vote contingent on passing a literacy test, which was administered by white registrars who had total control over that process. Disenfranchisement was the keystone in this regime of racial separation that came to be known as Jim Crow. And here's what is important, I think, to understand about Jim Crow. Yes, it was an expression of white racism, and we shouldn't forget that. But it was more than that. Jim Crow was a system of power and plunder that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of a few and privileged private interests over the common good. How did it do that? Well, in part, Jim Crow drove Black earnings down to near subsistence levels. That in turn devalued all labor, white as well as Black. And Jim Crow protected that plunder by persuading ordinary whites not to lift their voices in protest, lest they lose the psychological wages of whiteness, as identified by W.B. Du Bois. Now, conservatives were euphoric in 1900. They believed that with disenfranchisement, they had solved what they called the Negro problem for all time. But as one observer noted, every new generation would have to sort out for itself the underlying questions of race and democracy. That's because even in the depths of Jim Crow segregation, Black North Carolinians refused to surrender their claim on equal citizenship and a fair share of the social resources and economic opportunities in the state. Now, examples of that abound, many of which, most of which actually are missing from history books and public memory. Consider, for instance, the story of Lewis Austin, editor of the Carolina Times in Durham, who in the 1930s encouraged the small number of African Americans who were registered to vote to affiliate with the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party and contest white power on its own grounds. Similarly, how many of us know about the more than 20,000 Black tobacco workers in Winston-Salem and in market towns of Eastern North Carolina, who in the 1940s formed a labor union to win better wages and working conditions and supported the election of Black local officials who were among the first in the Jim Crow South to defeat white opponents? Or how many of us know the story of James Walker, one of the first Black graduates of UNC's law school, who in the 1950s moved to Eastern North Carolina and began doing pioneer work that laid the foundations for the voting rights movement in Eastern North Carolina. At every turn, these advocates of equal citizenship met with stiff and inventive resistance from white elites. When Blacks began to win elected offices, the state legislature acted to block their path by reorganizing council and municipal governments, shifting from ward-based representation to at-large schemes that mathematically diminish the power of Black ballots. And when Blacks countered with single shot, or what was sometimes called bullet voting, lawmakers prohibited the practice and ordered that single shot ballots be discarded. As one veteran of the struggle observed, the lesson was always the same. You beat the white man at one trick and he will try another. Now, these historical episodes provide a useful framework, I think, for understanding the debate over civil rights, voting rights in our time. Our contemporary story really begins with the civil rights movement and more particularly the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which provided the tools for enforcing the 15th and 19th Amendments to the Constitution. A change didn't come all at once, but over the course of 2 decades, a series of court rulings and ongoing grassroots organizing pried open the door to increase Black political participation. By 1989, 19 Black lawmakers served in the North Carolina legislature, and more than 400 Black office holders served in county and municipal governments statewide. And these numbers have not been seen since the late 19th century, before the time of disenfranchisement. These gains in Black political influence provided an essential ingredient for a new multiracial progressive alliance that in the 1990s and early 2000s reimagined the role of state government in providing economic opportunity and security for all North Carolinians. During these decades, lawmakers increased spending on public education. They raised teacher salaries to the national level, established Smart Start, which poured millions of dollars into early childhood education. They increased Health Choice, a program for uninsured children. And to secure these achievements, lawmakers also eased and enlarged access to the ballot box. Key legislation permitted early voting, allowed voters who went to the wrong precinct on election day to cast a provisional ballot, permitted same-day registration, and created a system to pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds so they would have their names on the voter rolls when they turned 18. The net effect of these election laws was an increase in Black political participation sufficient to deliver a razor-thin victory and majority for Barack Obama in North Carolina in 2008. Now, a conservative reaction that followed took predictable form. In 2010, conservatives who since the 1960s had been marching beneath the Republican banner won control of state legislature. They did so in a campaign filled with dog whistles, evoking what white supremacists a century earlier would have called Negro domination. And 3 years later, this new conservative majority, acting just weeks after the Supreme Court effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act, passed the most comprehensive reforms to voting procedures, and for good measure added a requirement for voter photo ID. As I said at the beginning, the U.S. Fourth Circuit overturned HB 589. They did so on the basis of clear evidence that what they called because of race, North Carolina lawmakers had imposed strict limitations on the right to vote. Now let's think about that phrase for a moment, because of race. And I'd suggest that it's only half right. HB 589 clearly bore the mark of racial animus, but Republicans did not seek to disenfranchise Black and Latino voters simply because of their skin color. As in past, suppression of the minority vote was central to a much broader conservative agenda that's rooted in a markedly narrow conception of our obligations to one another as citizens and of the balance between private interests and the welfare of the whole. The lawmakers who restricted the voting rights also rejected federal funds to expand Medicaid to uninsured North Carolinians. They repealed the Racial Justice Act, which gave prisoners on death row the right to have their sentences commuted to life if they could show racial bias had affected either their trial or conviction. They eliminated the state's earned income tax credit, which economists across the political spectrum generally agree is one of the most effective tools for lifting people out of poverty. They cut spending on public education and made the state's unemployment benefits some of the stingiest in the nation. Although Republicans have remained in power for over a decade, there's been continuous pushback against these conservative policies. The Moral Monday movement, led by the Reverend William Barber, mobilized thousands of citizens, Black, white, Latino, across the state to protest the threat to our democracy. The NAACP, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, Planned Parenthood, and many other organizations joined this movement and challenged Republican legislation in courts. At the same time, the Moral Monday movement articulated a political and social vision that reiterated many of the demands of earlier generations and expanded them to include concerns of today. Now, let me conclude just by going back over a couple points that I hope might guide some of our discussion. First, North Carolina has a long history of voter suppression that ranges from overt violence through measures that on the face appear race neutral, but when implemented, have a profound discriminatory effect on minority voters, particularly Black voters. Second point, Black citizens in North Carolina have never given up the battle for equal participation in our democratic system, not in the post-Reconstruction period when Black men continued to vote and win election to Congress and the General Assembly, not after disenfranchisement when Black men and women challenged the Democratic Party from within, not in the 1940s when thousands of African-American tobacco workers used the power of their unions to register and vote and elect Blacks to office, not in the 1950s and 60s when local voting rights movements sprang up across Eastern North Carolina, not after the passage of the Voting Rights Act when it took constant legal actions to make that law a reality, and not in the post-Republican takeover of the state government when the Moral Monday movement organized protests around the state. The third point is that the struggle for voting rights has also always been a struggle for economic rights. When race has been used as an instrument of exclusion from political life, the result has been a society in which vast numbers of citizens, Black and white alike, are denied elements of meaningful freedom: a living wage, access to quality education, healthcare, and housing. And finally, we've seen that equal citizenship, civil rights, and economic rights have been advanced in those moments when North Carolinians have formed strong interracial and today multiracial alliances. And when those alliances have been weakened by racial appeals, and in the worst instances, racial appeals combined with violence, democracy itself has been in peril. Well, I'll end with those points and look forward to more comment and later our discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, for starting us off with this very historical context to voter suppression. When we talk about uncertainty now, especially with COVID-19, we look at the issues of housing and housing injustice and the issue of affordable living conditions, living wages. When we look at education, we think of these things as isolated incidences, but I think you have weaved together in this narrative in Fragile Democracy a sense of understanding that these things are not as uncertain as they seem to be. And there is a certainty in regards to legislation. And then there's a certainty in regards to litigation, which takes us to Attorney Joyner. Attorney Joyner, your work on really on a national level, but more specifically here in North Carolina, has helped us to unpack and uncover a lived experience behind the academic research that is featured in Fragile Democracy. If you would, as we kind of go into the first part of our question and answer, give us some sort of a contemporary narrative and some of the strategies around voting rights as it results in this understanding of protest politics and policy. I think a lot of times we think of these things as again, as vacuums, but you have a lived experience that shows the interconnection of the people power, of the policy power, and the litigation power. So I want to go to you for a few moments for your thoughts around Fragile Democracy, and then also for this narrative piece and this inclusion of this trifecta in our, as Robert called, our long fight to really be engaged in this democratic process. I'll turn it over to you, Attorney Joyner.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, and good morning to all of you. Certainly want to thank Professor Korstad for that overview that he provided you with, that can kind of put in context where we are now and where we've been and what we have done to get out of the situations that we have been forced to deal with. And I think I want to just start this thing off, this discussion off with this notion that if you fight, you can win. And the history involved in African Americans and our struggle for political participation and equality within this state and in this nation certainly centers around this notion of fighting and winning. And fighting, of course, begins with organizing, the necessity of organizing, as well as the necessity of educating. Educating flows from an understanding of what has happened and the history, and being able to articulate to people just what has occurred, drawing the strings together so that you can visualize where it is that you need to go to deal with the oppression that's being directed in your way. And I want to just kind of just flip back to Reconstruction for a moment to start us off. We are aware that in 1868, that Abraham Galloway, Bishop John Hood, Henry Cherry, Isham Sweat, James Harris, and others were a part of the first 17 African Americans who were elected to the initial General Assembly, North Carolina, during Reconstruction. That did not happen by happenstance. It occurred because these individuals had organized and remembered what the history in North Carolina had been. Beginning in 1865 with the creation or the organization of the North Carolina Freedmen's Convention, which was held in Raleigh. African Americans, 117 of them from 42 counties in the state, came together to plan an agenda as to what it is that we demand from this government. And those demands were put together by so-called free Africans, as well as newly emancipated former slaves. In North Carolina, there was a large population of free Africans who were a part of this state's political process. And up until 1835, those individuals could vote. And in 1835, that vote was taken away. And many of those individuals who were a part of this free African community remembered 1835 when we got into 1865 and 1868, and learning from that process made it a priority that the new North Carolina Constitution would include a guarantee that African Americans and all people of color, all people who were citizens of the state would be able to vote. And they pushed and fought for that. But that was a part of a concentrated effort, a part of the agenda that had been created in 1865 that paved the way for that fight. And Abraham Galloway and Bishop Hood and others pushed that notion into the North Carolina Constitution. And when you look at the Constitution today, you see the results of that effort. And those efforts shows up in what the constitutional demands, the guarantees, and the protections are that are part of the present day Constitution. Not only did they push it in a policy perspective of making it a part of the Constitution, but they then brought to life just what those demands meant by actually running for office. And they became candidates for office. And again, indicated that 17 of them ended up being elected to the initial North Carolina General Assembly, 14 of those in the House, 3 in the Senate. But that resulted from hard work. It resulted from an effort to help people to understand what were the shackles that bound us, and then how that occurred, and then what it is that we need to move forward. And the forward thinking part of that effort included constitutionalizing the right to vote and the right for political participation without having a property requirements, the educational efforts, and other components of the North Carolina Constitution, progressive in those days, actually radical in those days, that led North Carolina to move forward. And then also to create a base among these free Africans who were typically property owners and former slaves, many of whom were not property owners, but who understood, based on what they were able to get from the coalition, the ability and the necessity of becoming property owners, becoming business owners, and being educated, highly educated within the communities that we were in. So you found all of those efforts, and Professor Kostad mentioned that in his opening, but it was a part of a struggle. It was a part of a struggle, and that struggle continued, and it continued throughout Reconstruction, even though there were fits and battles, physical intimidation directed to undermine efforts by African Americans to vote. They came out religiously, and they voted at 90 to 95% of their population or eligible voters at the time. And this is before women could vote in this country. But it was an organizing effort, a mobilizing effort, and an educating effort that kept the community engaged, involved, and knowledgeable about what was going on. We trace ourselves up to 1898 with the Wilmington race riot, where there was an overthrow of the Wilmington city government after the Democrats had resumed control of the North Carolina General Assembly, and then the effort to deny to every citizen in North Carolina the right to vote. They took away the registration and forced everyone to re-register in the state. African Americans did not give up. They attempted to register, but were kept out of that effort through the literacy test and the poll taxes that became a part of the new North Carolina Constitution at that point. And that began what I call the segregated Jim Crow era, where African Americans were relegated to third class citizenship. Some people call it second class. I call it third class or no class citizenship that we have. But we did not stop fighting at that point. So even though there were efforts to keep us from voting, we voted in other ways. We voted with our educational institutions. All over the state of North Carolina, African Americans focused on educating children such that they would be able to fight against the efforts to disenfranchise us. Now, a piece that's not really talked about is the great Black migration that occurred beginning in 1910, 1920, where literally millions of African Americans left North Carolina and went north, New York and Newark and Pennsylvania, Baltimore and DC. And the value of that was not so much that they left, but they went to these states and became politically active. And they began to vote in those locales that they found themselves. And that served as an incentive for African Americans still in North Carolina to know that we can do this, that it is possible to become a part of the political process. And that is exactly what they did as a part of this great migration. So focusing in on excellence in education, which the segregated Black schools became, the political activities in the North by those individuals who had left the state, the creation of a new Black culture from the North and then spreading back down gave models to African Americans who were in North Carolina that there is indeed a way to beat this Jim Crow animal. And that led us into the 1940s with the election of Reverend Kenneth Williams in Winston-Salem and the coalition between the labor unions. And then in 1935, the creation of the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs that continues today as the Durham Committee, which created models that other communities could follow in organizing, mobilizing, and educating our people to move forward toward the effort to undermine Jim Crow. And it's also important for us to understand that as successes occurred, they generated other activities. So Reverend Kenneth Williams and his success led to the election subsequently of G.K. Butterfield, Dr. G.K. Butterfield in Wilson, and Fred Carnage in Raleigh, and William Hampton in Greensboro, and Rensselaer Harris in Durham. So in the 50s and 60s, these models carried over to show that if you fight, you can win. And they fought and they won, and this provided examples going forward, such that when the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed in Congress, that gave to us protections against what was going on in the political arena, our people were able to step forward. And the best example of that is in 1968. Eva Clayton, Henry Fry, Reginald Hawkins, who ran for governor, had the gall to run for governor in 1968. Mickey Mishaw, all as an effort to increase the registration of African Americans, went out and put their bodies on the line to fight for elected positions. Henry Fry won, the others did not, but they did in another sense. That registration increased tremendously all across North Carolina. And in doing that, engaging in that battle, it showed that if you fight, you can win. So these were efforts that led us forward. Henry Fry was then joined by George Johnson in 1970, Mickey Mashaw in 1972, Fred Alexander in 1974, which led us really up until the 1980s, where we had 4 out of 170 in the House and Senate elected. And one would think that that was a terrible disadvantage, but they were fighters in the legislature, and they were models for others. And then others wanted to be and created then the impetus for the Thornburg versus Jingles lawsuit, which looked at this notion of multi-member district and the attack on multi-member district. Professor Kostad mentioned the single shot voting that occurred, an idea created by African Americans to counter the multi-member districts. And then the legislature had to outlaw the use of single member districts. So, all right, so you're going to do that, then we're going to fight. And in 1982, Thornburg versus Jingles was filed, and that was successful. And then automatically, with that success, the number of African Americans jumped in the General Assembly to 17. And then around the state, other African Americans were seeking positions in their local communities and were winning. And of course, in 1990, you had Dan Blue coming in as Speaker of the House, the first African American in the South to be elected as a Speaker of the House. Toby Fitch and others joining him with Mickey Mashaw, then to push for what we have now as early voting and all of these other opportunities. The creation of congressional districts that resulted in the elections of Eva Clayton and Mel Watt as the first 2 African Americans elected to Congress since George H. White back in 1900. So all of these efforts involve organization, mobilization, education, and the notion that if you fight, you can win. So as we look at where we are today, and we have more African American legislators in the General Assembly, in state and local government and county positions and school boards than we've ever had before. And because of that, we're under attack. We're under attack on every end. And you can never forget the fact that we are under attack. But the remedy is simple: organizing, mobilizing, educating, and advancing the notion of if you fight, you will win. And that's where we are today. We have a long list of political positions that are being contested right now. And we need to help our people to understand the value of registration, political participation in terms of voting, but also providing our people with something to vote for, someone to vote for. And on our list of candidates today, we find a whole long list of people who we can vote for, who will serve and promote this progressive notion. So as I end this addition to what Professor Kostad had said, if we don't fight, we don't win. And if we don't fight now, we are going to find ourselves slipping back to where it was that we have fought to excavate ourselves from. So with that, Marcus, I'm going to turn it back to you.
I don't know how many mic drop moments you've had in your career, but that was one right there, Attorney Joyner. We are facing so much uncertainty right now that we've failed to recognize that there has been, in this long narrative of oppression and suppression, a fight back. Oftentimes when we are talking to folks about how we need to vote at the end of each election cycle, we scapegoat the community without necessarily thinking about the impediments But when we go to the polls, in every single instance, when candidates are compelling and attracting a large number of our electorate, we win systemic change for our people. The one question I have for you both for this first half, and take time to answer this and however you feel forward, maybe about 2 minutes each. We're in an either or moment in time now. I think both of you, Dr. Corstan and Attorney Joyner, mentioned the fact that it takes both. It's not voting or economy. These things are connected. It is not, protest versus politics. These things are connected. It's not apathy or alone. It's actually, other elements of suppression. How do we in this moment get our communities, and I'm thinking about the individuals that are watching, representing organizations from across the state, in different contexts, we're having to have this either or conversation in community right now as we try to compel folks to the polls in this midterm election cycle. What is one way in this work that you've done that you've seen has been effective in fighting back against this either or phenomenon that has us not seeing the connectedness in the struggles and in our kind of path forward and bringing back some certainty in our democracy? And I'll start with you, Bob.
Thanks, Marcus. Well, just quickly, I think there's been kind of rightly so a lot of effort on the issue of voting rights and getting people to the polls over the last since the Obama election and kind of pushback by Republicans. And I think that probably not enough of that has put together these issues of kind of continuing policy concerns around, all the things that we've both talked about. It's kind of been a single focus, and I think that single focus is it's hard to sustain, and it's if all you do is kind of get into the election cycle and you forget about all the things that need to be done between that time. I think there's a lot of good stuff going on in the state right now. A lot of voting rights organizations. There's a lot of organizing going on at the grassroots in different places, some of which wasn't been done a few years ago. I think we could use more coordination in the state, among those different groups. We got, dozens of groups going out doing voter registration, voter education, and maybe if we had, maybe if that was coordinated a little bit better, we would have some better results. So I think that's one thing is to, see how the economic and the political issues go together, and then also to see how we can build coalitions that are kind of more that communicate better and are more tightly working together. Those would be a couple things I would think.
That's great. Attorney Joyner?
Yes, I would certainly endorse everything that's been said. Add to that that we need to put in the work in these local communities. We need to return, and we need to return to some of the old ways. We need to knock on doors. We need to talk to people in the backyards. We need to talk to people at the church. We need to talk to people at the bar, at the club. Wherever we find them, we need to talk to them at the barbershop, at the beauty salon, about the importance not only of voting, but for holding elected officials accountable for what it is that they are supposed to be doing. Because we can educate people no matter where we find them. And we should have a 100% goal in our mind with respect to registration and voting. Everybody in our household ought to be registered to vote. And if they're not registered to vote, then we ought to put them out in the pasture. Everybody in our church ought to be registered to vote. And then that we make sure that they go to vote, whether we have to rent buses or cars to take them down, that's our responsibility. Where we have family members who are in nursing homes and can't get to the polls, we should show them how to vote by mail or help to load them up on a chariot and ride them down to the poll into the curbside voting lanes. But we have to put in the work. And as we make these contacts, we have to show people what it is that this voting means and how it inures to our benefit if we do it, and what will happen if we don't do it. And people have to see this visually. And it's our responsibility, I think, to provide them with this type of information, education, and then that we take over the effort of organizing and mobilizing. And I certainly think that we need to coordinate with all of our allies, and we should create new allies as we move along the way. But if we're sending our children to college, for instance, we send them with the notion that not only do you register and vote and get grades, but then as soon as you can, you run for a political office so that you can help to develop the policy and to make your generation more meaningful in this fight to prevent the kinds of things that happen at the end of Reconstruction. So those are just some of the notions that I have in response to your question.
If you've been following from the beginning, you're probably already on your second page of the notes. And I really appreciate our beginning panelists for this historical contextual narrative about the fight back and talking about, number one, how we got to this fragile democracy when we talk about uncertain times. And then in our community, what that fight has looked like in the midst of so much historical uncertainty. And I appreciate you, Dr. Korstad and Attorney Joyner, for joining us in this conversation. And I thank you in the chat. Those of you that are participating virtually, please, let's feel free to use this space to ask questions as we go from this context of history to this current analysis and look at where we go from here in this uncertainty. And to lead us in the second part of this conversation, I'm excited to have Dr. Hall and Conan kick us off to really look at where we are now. We've had a lot of changes in the midst of COVID-19, a lot of shifts in our state and our demographic makeup. And when we think about the work that we have to do right now on the second day of early voting in the midterm election, there's some analysis that we can bring forth to help us do better work, do more intentional work, and figure out exactly where we need to go with our programs and outreach for voter engagement. So Dr. Hall, I look forward to your conversation, kick off this conversation to your presentation at this time.
Good morning to everybody. And I was just fascinated by that historical odyssey that was led by Bob and Erv, and they have certainly set the stage for what we want to talk about. I have a little presentation here, and I think Marcus is going to allow me to share my screen. We'll see how this works. Sometimes I'm okay. Can everybody see the PowerPoint there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, so first of all, I would like to thank the summit for the invitation to participate in this very important discussion. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to throw out some that will help to organize our discussion about what we ought to be doing during this critical election year as we are in 2022 and as we prepare for 2024 and even 2023 in between. Because I always emphasize to my students and to anybody who will listen that the most important election is whatever the next election is. And so there's an election every year somewhere. And so it's important to prepare for that. And I always try to put comments within the context of voter empowerment and exactly what that is. And there are four important elements of voter empowerment, which we all know: voter registration, voter education, election protection, and GOTV, get out the vote. I have asterisks beside voter registration and voter education because as I looked at some of the data, not only the statistics with regard to voting, but also some of the survey research that has taken place with regard to why people don't vote. It seems important that we don't look at these elements of voter empowerment as isolated from each other, and I know we never do. But what I've seen is that there is an importance of trying to meld, especially voter registration and voter education together. That as a part of voter registration, we must educate because it's important that we know exactly what is at stake. But just as Erv said, what is at stake in terms of winning, but also what is at stake in terms of losing. And we know that elections have consequences. And we can see some of the consequences now that are going on that help to explain the regression with regard to public policy and the impact that it has upon the quality of life of people. And ultimately, if politics cannot be a tool for improving the quality of life for people, then what good is it? So again, I'm just going to go over a little bit of data that will hopefully spark some conversation about things. First of all, you should know that in terms of party registration, this is a fairly recent occurrence. It received some news coverage. We're no longer a majority Democratic state, nor Republican state. The people like to look at us as either a red state or a blue state. But what we know is that the largest group in terms of party identification is no party identification. We have a certain percentage of people who register as Republicans at 30% or so. We have a certain number who register as Democrats at slightly over 34%, but the largest number would be those who are unaffiliated. So when we talk about party registration and registering people to vote, we have to know there's an increasing alienation or disaffection with the two major political parties. So as we go into voter registration, that's something to consider. Is the fact that it's no longer just a Republican or Democratic thing, that people are trying to think outside the box, they're trying to think independently about things, even though those who are unaffiliated do have a tendency to lean one way or the other with regard to how they vote. But in terms of what they are expressing when they register to vote, is clearly they want to register more as independent and unaffiliated. In terms of racial registration, here we see, you see my cursor, we see that 20.46% of those who are registered, and these are all North Carolina numbers, of those who are registered to vote in the state of North Carolina are made up of African Americans. And you see the percentage for white voters as well as for Hispanic voters. So again, just get a little data. But interestingly enough, when we look at the percent of those who are registered, because you have a group of people who are eligible to vote, but then what percent of those who are eligible to vote over the age of 18 and other qualifications that go along with that, who are registered to vote. In terms of the total population in the state of North Carolina, slightly below 70% for the white portion of the electorate. It's right at 70%. For the Black portion of the electorate, it's a little below 70%. So in terms of that, there is room for significant work to be done to increase the percentage of eligible Black voters to actually register to vote. Okay. And this just repeats that data without the graph. But what this means is that between 450,000 to 500,000 unregistered Blacks in the state of North Carolina, okay? Let me repeat that. There are between 450,000 and 500,000 unregistered Blacks in the state of North Carolina. This is very important because these are some of the people who we really need to reach, who we really need to include in this fight that Erv was talking about, because Erv was right. When we fight, when we organize, when we fight, we win. We don't win everything, but there are certainly historical examples that we have already heard. We're working together, working within the Black community, working with others outside of the Black community. There has been progress. Now, in terms of survey data as to why people don't vote, these are national results, but of course, as you can imagine, it may apply to people here in the state of North Carolina too. Why people do not register to vote. I don't want to vote, so I don't need to register, 44%. I intend to register, but haven't gotten around to it, 27%. There's not been a candidate or issue that has inspired me to register to vote, 25%. I don't want to register for privacy or security reasons, 11%. It's not convenient, 9%. I don't know how to register, 6%. I am not eligible due to a felony conviction, 5%. So I put this up here because if you go back to what I said at the beginning, we have to really meld voter education and voter registration. A lot of these issues that as to why people don't vote can be addressed through a robust voter education effort to inform people how they register to vote, to inform people who the candidates are, to inform them what the public policy agenda would be once the vote is done. So the importance of voter education and voter registration actually going together on parallel tracks. Also, some other information here, less than 20% of eligible citizens have been offered the chance to register at a motor vehicle or other government agency, which of course they also, by law, they are supposed to do. And again, these are national data. The unregistered are more likely to say that they do not vote because they dislike politics or believe voting would not make a difference. And you hear that all the time. It's not going to make a difference if I vote or not. Elections have consequences. When we look at what's going on now, all over the country, really, where states have become laboratories of oppression, as some people have put it. When we think about what is being done in terms of social policy, when we think about what is being done in terms of voter suppression, because elections have consequences. And certainly we don't have to look any further than looking at elections in North Carolina to see that elections have consequences, okay? You don't register, if you don't register and really overperform with regard to registration and GOTV, we need to do more than our proportion within the population. That leads to bad politicians. Bad politician leads to bad public policy. Bad public policy has an impact on our quality of life. At least 13% of, going back up here, while people who are registered but vote infrequently say they do not vote more often because they're not informed enough about the candidates or the issues. And again, this goes back to the importance of voter education. At least 13% of the unregistered, generally, those who are younger and more civically engaged, say they could be motivated to register to vote in the future. So again, there's the possibility for increasing the proportion of the electorate that are made up of the Black community, and therefore increase African-American participation. At several conversations I've been a part of over the last few weeks or so, you hear people talking about sleeping giants. So I just want to throw this in at the end. Sleeping giants, so of course the unregistered. As I said, I'll mention it again, around 500,000 African-Americans are not registered to vote, a sleeping giant. We can wake that giant up. And of course, there's overlap between a lot of these things. The faith community, Just as Erv said, our churches, going to church and emphasizing the importance of participation without violating any kind of IRS regulations or anything like that. You can urge people to become a part of the process. Our HBCUs, sleeping giants. We know that over 40,000 students attend North Carolina HBCUs, and if just 1% of the 40,000 students who attend North Carolina HBCUs not only voted, but became members of cadres of activists who will go back to their communities, leave their campuses, and go back to their home communities to mobilize people, to register people, to educate people about the importance of the political process. A sleeping giant. The poor, those who feel marginalized, not a part of the process because we don't hear people speaking to their issues. Too many elected officials and those who seek to become elected officials don't even mention poverty or the poor. And of course, youth, also sleeping giants. And so if we can mobilize and shake up these sleeping giants, we can really turn things around here in the state of North Carolina and nationally. And so I have faith in it because I do believe that if we organize, if we work together, if we fight, we will win.
Dr. Hall,
Thank you, Reverend.
awesome. Excellent, excellent. Conan, there's several things that are happening right now. We're coming to the conclusion. There's a bunch of questions in the chat. I want to ask our panelists, Dr. Hall, Attorney Joyner, Dr. Corstand, if you can engage with our individuals in the chat, answering some of these questions. And I want Conan, I want you to close us out, Conan, because you have you're at the precipice of this change. You're seeing campaigns across the state and across the country. Make this plain for us in next steps language. Wrap this all up and give us your assessment as we close here today.
We're in a situation right now where never before have we seen so many Black and brown people run for office. That is a direct correlation to the expansion of voting rights. All right. We're not just representing minority majority districts. And as we start to see the change in how the U.S. Supreme Court enacts laws around our redistricting efforts, we will start to see the waning of minority majority districts in a lot of places. And this is something that has been on the docket for many years. The good doctor from Duke and from Central stated, the erosion of voting rights is real. It is something that is systemic, that is happening not just at the ballot box, but also in the representation. And it is something that we all have to be very aware of. So record Black and brown folks are running, record Black and brown people are representing majority districts, not minority majority districts, white-led districts, to say it plainly for those. And this is a great conversation to be had. And it's one that is nuanced. I know the professor from Duke mentioned about the Democratic Party being a stronghold from the 60s, coming out of Jim Crow and leading into from the civil rights movement, of that from an empowerment portion of Black and brown folks. That is true, but it is not the entire conversation moving forward. That is representative from how we actually have our lieutenant governor currently, or two members of the Court of Appeals here in North Carolina. Or if you look to our neighbor in the north, the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia is in the same boat, where they're Black folks representing a different party. This is a nuanced conversation, and it's one that has to be had about issues and values. Who represents what you believe in and how strongly you believe it and how you're going to activate. So we are faced with a new set of circumstances and really a new crisis in terms of the identity of who we are as a people and what we want to represent. I particularly work with a lot of progressive candidates. I lean left on that in terms of ideology, and that is not an endorsement or statement from the Black Alliance, but it is one that has to be talked about from the standpoint of what are we really fighting for? And from my lens of morals and values and the people I actually work with and represent, that is what's on the table, that we have to lean forward to be able to address those needs and concerns. So whether it be resolved from educational aspects, those from voting rights, healthcare measures, whatever is a kitchen table discussion. And we often use these words from yesteryear to explain it. What are you on the phone talking to your family and friends about? What is being discussed at the kitchen table? What's being discussed at Sunday dinner? Because at the end of it all, this is not a Fox News or a CNN or MSNBC discussion. This is a what's in your pocket or pocketbook discussion that determines where and what direction you want to lean in. So as I help folks run in different places, from school board and soil and water all the way up to governor and the presidency, I often tell folks a couple of things that I'll leave with you, and not to stand on my soapbox too long. When you're running statewide in North Carolina, I often joke that if I can drop you in the middle of the tobacco field and you can find your way home, I can get you elected statewide. That has everything to do with the fact that you know how to talk to people and be able to deliver a message accordingly and be good in any weather, as the young people would say, because it's a situation by which you need to be able to reach across the state, not just in the urban corridors, but also in the rural corridors. And since we have so much flight out of our rural areas, it is one that we have to have a nuanced conversation around, because just winning the top 20 counties of 100 in North Carolina is not enough anymore. That is the old playbook. We have to play in every pocket and every corner of the state. And then the other portion of it is, are you willing to make the sacrifice necessary? This is an identity outcry from our candidates of sacrifice for what it takes to actually have people believe in your message. You can't show up the day before the test and not have studied and expect a good result. And it is the same way in terms of campaigning. People have to go out here, earn the vote, give good sound talking points about what they believe in and what they plan to carry out on, and then hold themselves accountable. And I have this conversation often with folks, as I had this morning with another candidate, of making sure they understand that you are an elected official, that ownership is on you, and you have to be held accountable to be able to explain your positions, right or wrong, you know, good or bad, or really what the larger talk point is, what was happening yesterday may change today because the circumstances change. And as good elected folks that we have serving, and those who are climbing the actual ladder in terms of positions and power, accountability is at a huge magnifying glass and scope now, simply because we are in the age of information and social media, and a lot more time and dedication is being paid attention to how we interact with each other. It is not simply as good enough to say, I have the endorsement of X person, I need you to roll with me. It is everything and all the above, and being able to talk about it at a very high level, similar to all the panelists today. And I yield to our chairman.
Such a great way to end, high level. We got to scratch way deep down, and we have to go all the way up and make sure that we are hitting all the points in this moment. Thank you so much, everyone. The next session is already in progress. It's a healthcare conversation. Access to healthcare is an important commitment statement of the Black Alliance. But we thank you all, Dr. Corstan, Attorney Joyner, Leader Morgan, and Dr. Hall, for your time. And we thank you all for participating in this conversation of the North Carolina Black Summit virtual experience, unpacking a fragile democracy for the Black community. Thank you all very much, and we'll return back now to our session already in progress.